Hey folks, this is Mr. Chicken, and we are now getting into part 3 of the Raven tutorial, and we're going to finish up the mechanical components in this one. So we're going to be hooking up the head parts now. So it's going to move kind of fast, but we'll take our time a little bit later, and I think it'll be fine. Now, I forgot to drill these holes, so 16th inch holes in there, but you should have done that at the beginning. Now, we're going to take that head off, and we're going to bend the thinnest piece of the two short pieces of piano wire into this little guy, and we're moving kind of fast here, but I've got scans of my pieces of wire, so you can actually just print those out full size and bend yours to match. And you can find those on the website and in the Facebook group. Now, what I've done is I bent a zigzag to hook into the servo horn on that little HS53 servo, and then just this little hook to go into that hole on the jaw. So first I threaded it into the jaw, and now I'm poking it into the servo horn, and then you see that's how it holds it in. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the screw. This is the 440 2-inch screw. We're going to thread it into the outer part of the head, and then into the corresponding hole in the jaw, and then it goes through the hole in the acrylic plate, then continues on back into the jaw again and out the skull. So you see what's going on. Duh, duh. And now what we're going to use to hold this in is a 440 T-nut. And it's a little bit larger than the screw. So if you wanted to drill out the hole in the skull a little bit bigger, you could. I found I can usually just kind of press fit it. The reason we're doing this is that it takes up less space, and so isn't going to be quite as bulky on the head as a regular nut. So see, that's if you wanted to put a dab of super glue on the T-nut to hold it down to the skull, that would be a pretty good idea. And so now we're just going to take our 1/4 inch, that's the smallest length of the 440 screws, and we're going to screw the skull down to those little brackets that we had installed earlier on the acrylic skull plate. If you can get your finger in there to push the servo back and forth a bit, we now have a moving jaw. So now I do recommend at this point that you go ahead, now that we've test fit universal joint onto the body and the skull, that now you go ahead and put a dab of super glue or Loctite onto threaded rod to hold that down to the servo plate, the acrylic, so that it doesn't loosen up. Now we're going to connect the music wire that's going to control the head movement. What I've done here is I've propped up the head so that that universal joint is at neutral, straight across. And so we're going to take one of our two longest pieces of music wire, and we're going to put a little zigzag in the end just to hook onto that servo horn. And now we want to connect it to the hole that we drilled near the center of the top of the head. So what's in our way right now is just that it's not going to line up straight to that spot. So we need to put a little bit of sort of gradual zigzag into that wire to get us closer. So I've marked the point where it's going to clear the servo when the servo turns backwards. And now I just marked what's going to be in line with the skull. So when I put these two bends, now you'll see when we reconnect that piece to the servo, now you'll see that it's going to be in line with that hole in the top of the head. And so now all we have to do is put a little loop in the end of that, and I'll mark where that hole actually is. And now we can take it off, make that little loop, and now it'll connect. And this will give us our up-down movement. So again, I'm sorry that I breezed past the jaw one really fast, but I think hopefully now this is starting to make some sense, and we'll do it a couple more times. And again, you'll be able to find scaled scans of my wires on the website. And now I would recommend, before you actually connect them here, that you reinforce those little 16th inch holes that you drilled in the plastic skull. Just do a little super glue around the edges just to make that a little thicker and stronger, because again, that plastic can tear through, and when it's all covered up in the fur that we're going to do later on, it's not going to be a problem. That'll kind of hold it into place, but just to be safe, do a little donut of super glue around the edge of the holes. So here we go. Now we're doing exactly the same thing. You'll watch the placement on the servo horn that I do for these. And of course, I've made sure that those servos are centered. And so now you can see we're going to do the same thing that we did before. We've put a zigzag in the part that's going to go into the servo, and now we're going to go ahead and put our little jog in the wire where we've got clearance to center that up with where the hole actually is in line with the head. So you know, you've got a certain amount of leeway in how you actually do this. But I do recommend you just take a look at the pictures of my bends so you can see a little more clearly what we're going for here. You can see we've done this exactly the same way as the last one. We put our first little bend in, we put our second little jog to line us up with that hole, and now we've marked where that hole ends up. Now that the wire is positioned correctly, we're going to put our little loop in and then hook it all together. So mark the spot, take it out, and bend that little loop. I'm just using a small pair of needle nose pliers for all of this. But when it comes time to trim off the extra wire, you're going to want some kind of wire cutters. Now you can do this with pretty much any wire cutters that you have, but what's really, really nice that you'll see me do in a second here is these mini bolt cutters. It's from a company called Knipex, Knipex, and they are amazing for cutting really tough pieces of round stock of any sort. And there they are. These are not cheap, but very cool tool to have for quick cuts of stuff that otherwise you would have really struggled with just regular wire cutters. So that's the bend of this part, and we can just slip it back into place, thread it on. And now you can give it a little test move just by turning the servo. And you can see your left, right, and your up, down should both be working. Now, in order to install the wing bracket, we're first going to prep on there the spring that's going to later be used on the hip. So we're taking our 1/2 inch screw, we're going on the loop of the spring, then through one of those pass-through holes on a bracket, and then a double-threaded bracket on the other side of the acrylic plate. So basically the same thing we've been doing before, just a longer screw, and getting that spring on there early. So get that on there nice. So now we're going to make what's the structure for the wings. So what you can do is take those two pieces of brass and you're going to mark one hole at an 1/8 inch in from the edge and another hole a 1/4 inch past that one. Now if you feel more comfortable giving yourself a little more room on the edge to drill that hole and then trimming it down later, which is what I did here, you can do that too. And here I'm just using a little center punch to make sure that I drill those holes in the right spot. That'll help the drill bit stay on track. If you don't have a center punch, you could just kind of poke it with a nail a little bit to give yourself a spot. Or, you know, I mean, if you're careful, you can get away without. Now, in drilling these holes, we're going to drill a 1/16 inch hole closest to the edge, and then an 1/8 inch hole after that. Now, a warning about this brass is it's very thin and it's very soft, which are properties that we want for these wing mounts. However, that means that if you're not careful in your drilling, these can kind of get grabbed onto the drill bit and twisted. So just go slow, drill the size that you mean to drill, and it'll work out fine. But be aware of that. Should you mess up your holes, there's enough material there that you could trim off the edge or flip it around. And there you go. When there's little burrs on there, you can just take an X-Acto knife or a little blade of some sort and clean those up. And you can see on this one where I left a 1/4 inch of extra material on the edge, so I'll trim that down to an 1/8 inch. And I'm just sanding that burrs off. So here we go. We're going to be mounting the wing bracket onto the body in order to connect those little floppy wings. We're going to take our acrylic wing bracket. This is probably the last 2 screws you've got left, except for the horde of 1/4 inchers. So go ahead and screw that down. This is a tight fit between these, so don't tighten that screw down all the way until you get both of them in place, because it can be a little tricky to align. So go ahead and get them both on there, and then you can tighten them down like so. And now we're ready to get the wings ready to attach. So here we go with the wings. We're going to use a couple of 1/2 inch screws with a washer. Put that through the larger hole in the brass, and then another washer behind that, and that's going to help it move without unthreading the nut on the other end. So slide that onto the bracket, and then we're going to use one of our 440 lock nuts on here. Now, I would say don't bother trying to tighten this down all the way just yet, because we're going to have to take it off again in order to install the piano wire that's going to connect to these brass strips. But you do want to get it on there enough that you can see that it's in the right spot. So I went ahead and tightened it down most of the way. Ultimately, what you're going to go for is enough that it's not going to have a lot of slop, but is going to move freely like that. And so here's how the wires are going to be pulling those wings to make it flap. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our remaining two longer wires, and these are sort of the medium length ones. They're about 80 millimeters. And they're going to connect to the servo horn down there and then pull down on those wings. So I believe this servo horn I had to turn in order to get those two holes where I wanted them to. So as we did before, you know, if you have to take those servo horns off, just make sure that you're putting them back on centered. So I'm putting a little loop in the end, right? Just a little tube ends, and that's going to hook into the brass, into that smaller 16th inch hole. And then we're going to go and connect that to the inner hole on the 9 o'clock on that servo horn. So I'm marking where that hole is, and then I'm going to put our little jog into it. So I've marked the spot where it needs to be so that that wing is level when the servo is centered. And the idea is then that when that servo turns, it'll pull down and lift that wing up, right? So should be pretty good. And so we're going to go ahead and mark it and put that little jog in so that that can plug right into the closer 9 o'clock hole in the servo horn. And we're going to do the same thing on the second one, the wire for the other wing. But that's going to connect, as you'll see in a second, to the outer hole in the 9 o'clock position on the servo horn. What's important to note when you are bending the little jogs in the end of the piano wire here is that it's got to be able to clear as it turns around without catching on the other servo. So you may have to tweak it off to the side a little bit when you do the second one so that it doesn't tangle up together. So I'm trimming off the excess here so that there's just enough to hook onto the servo. And now you can see I've done the second one exactly the same way and connected them like that. And now tighten down your screws or loosen them if you've got them too tight. And there you go. Your wings will work just like that. So we're going to go ahead and connect the linkage to the hip servo. So what we're going to work off of is having the servo horn parallel to the servo, centered, and have that parallel to the arm that comes off of the leg. So I've already bent this piece of piano wire to connect right between those at this position. That's out of the final piece of wire, which is the short, thicker wire. But you do have to take the servo horn off in order to connect that. And so just make sure you put it back on in the center. And there you go. Now those will move together. So now we can connect the spring to that servo horn. So this is why we needed that third prong on the servo horn. So you can just drag it across, and I've already bent the little loop out open a bit with the needle nose pliers, and so I'm able to thread it in and then pinch it back shut around the servo horn. And this is very important because what this spring is doing is this spring is going to hold the body of the Raven so that the servo isn't physically lifting all the weight of the head and the body, because obviously that pivot point is all the way on the back end. So by having that spring connected here, we are helping the servo, we're pulling up all that weight for the servo. So that's it. You just built all the mechanics for the animatronic Raven. I suggest before you get any further at this point that you connect it to whatever you're going to be using to control the servos. Here I'm using the Palalu Maestro. And make sure that everything is centered correctly and set all of your limits so that you can get all of this stuff taken care of while it's easy to access and see the servos and the positions. And then once we get covering everything up in feathers and fur in the next step, you'll already know that all of this stuff is taken care of. So when you're done with that, let's move on to the final finishing of your animatronic Raven. You can, of course, get all of the information on the DIY animatronic Raven kit at my site, chickenprops.com. And I again encourage you, if you haven't yet, to join the Facebook Builders group to connect with everybody else who's building these kits and get all the information that they've learned. So thanks for watching. Part 4 is coming up next.